All right, well, hopefully you enjoyed the two blindness videos and then the magic videos. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about magic as misdirected attention, right? Um, Generally, if you're watching a magician, you've done it voluntarily, right? You went to go see a magician, or you chose that channel on TV, or something like that. Hardly ever are you sort of just have magic and sort of foisted on you, and you have to watch it when you didn't want to. And so there's a little bit of motivation when we watch a magician. Like we want to get swept away by it. Now, of course, if you're like most of us, you're like, well, I also want to know how you did it, right? Like, how was that done? So, as a member of the audience, there are aspects of the stimulus that are driving your attention, and that's by design. The magician knows a lot about how we focus our attention and uses that to try and get us to focus on one thing while missing the key thing that's, the so-called magic part, right? So stimulus driven attention is when we draw the audience's attention to something salient, but that is in fact irrelevant to the trick. So it's noticeable, it seems meaningful, but it's actually irrelevant to the trick. So a lot of magicians will do that. They'll have a bunch of explosions and a bunch of different kinds of information going on, and that is, attracting our attention, attractive women, other kinds of things. It's attracting our attention, but it's irrelevant to the trick. And that way they can kind of do the things it takes to make the trick happen. Now, goal-driven attention is where you get the audience engaged in some kind of demanding task. You get their attention focused on some kind of demanding task. So maybe you have them counting, or you have them remembering something, or imagining something, or something like that. And that way you've pulled some of their attention onto something that'll prevent them from actually noticing what you're doing. So, using that tendency of humans to have limited capacity, and the tendency of humans to get swept up with what they are focusing on, can be to your advantage if you're a magician. Now, how about driving? When you're driving, it's never a good thing to be distracted, right? Like, I mentioned that most of us as adults, we've overlearned the process of driving, and so we're able to pull our attention and devote part of it to something else besides what is directly in front of us on the road. So when we drive distractedly, we are letting the overlearned parts of driving take over for us, right? So we know how to steer the steering wheel. We know to look over our left shoulder before we merge. We know to look both ways before we cross a road. We know all these behaviors to engage in. The question is whether our attention is actually being applied as we look over our shoulder and check. Are we actually looking and seeing, or are we just going through the act of looking over, turning our head over our shoulder, right? Researchers have been very, interested in distracted driving ever since pretty much driving was invented. What factors can go into us being distracted? They've looked at things like the presence or absence of music. They've looked at the presence or absence of a passenger in the car. And more recently, they've really been looking at the presence or absence of a cell phone. So I'm going to give you these more recent studies where most of these have been being conducted down at the University of Utah, where they seem to have the proper kinds of driving simulators and the right funding for this. There are other labs that have been doing some of this research, but the University of Utah has really been like on the forefront of the distracted driving research. So they, in one study, designed a setup where you have cell phone use, and in some cases it was a handheld cell phone that the person actually had to hold up to their ear, and in other cases it was hands free, where they could just, like a lot of our cars have today, where you can just speak and hear in your regular sound system. So either hands held or hands free cell phone use. Listening to the radio is another condition, or driving with no distraction at all, no radio, no cell phone. And in the experiment, the people who were in the cell phone conditions were actually holding a conversation while they were in the driving simulator, and they were being asked to solve different kinds of problems, do math or different kinds of problems like that, while talking to the person on the phone. So it was really absorbing, right? Very cognitively effortful. And the question was whether that was more distracting than simply listening to the radio or just driving in silence. What they found is that it didn't, for one thing, did not matter whether it was hands held or hands free, at least for the tasks that they were doing. It was all a conversation in this experiment. There was no sending you a text while you were driving or something like that. This was all a verbal conversation. And so hands held or hands free did not matter as far as distraction. But what they found is that people who were talking on the cell phone had poorer control of their vehicle. So, as measured by this driving simulator, they had their acceleration and braking was not as smooth or steady. They tended to speed more often or go under the speed limit more often than people who were listening to the radio or not distracted at all. People who were talking on the cell phone were more likely to miss their assigned exit on the simulated freeway. They displayed a slower reaction time that made it look a lot like they were either above the legal limit for drinking and driving. Their reaction time was similar to that, or more similar to the average 85-year-old's reaction time. And as we age, our reaction time is slow. And so, slower reaction time, like an 85-year-old, that is significant slowing in the reaction time. Now, in other studies, not the one that I just described there, in other studies, they did go ahead and start doing things like, hey, reply to this text, or hey, look this thing up on the internet while you're driving, those kinds of things. And of course, with every detail where you're pulling your eyes away in order to look at the phone, you increase the problems in all of these distracted ways. What's really interesting is that we all think we can kind of look real quick a little bit and honestly that we're better drivers on average than other people are. We all think that, and that's impossible for it to be true, but we all kind of think it. And then we think, well, but I won't be as impaired as other people would be. Like I'm good at, like I can do it. I'm fine. But the truth is none of us can. None of us should be looking at our phones. We've been lucky if nothing has ever happened to us while we looked at our phones. We shouldn't probably be talking on the phone. Here's the difference between talking on your phone and talking to a passenger in the car. The passenger in the car can see the road too. And if something starts to happen, they'll probably say something to get your attention onto it. Hey, watch out. Or they know to shut up. Like, I see what's happening and I'm not helping right now. I'll just be quiet. Whereas a person on the phone has no idea maybe that you're even driving, right? These phones have gotten so good these days that we can't even hear the background road noise. And so certainly the person on the phone doesn't know to be quiet if there's traffic ahead, or to alert you if there's traffic ahead, or that there's a pedestrian crossing or anything like that. So a passenger in the car is actually a second set of eyes. A person on the phone is just a distraction. And so I've often had students say, well, what's the difference talking on the phone versus talking to somebody in the car? Well, that's the difference, right? It's any distraction that's created by the passenger in the car is compensated for by the fact that the passenger doesn't want you to hit someone or get in an accident, right? And so they're trying to save their own lives by paying, partly paying attention too. And so maybe between the two distracted people in the car, we actually have one cohesive distraction, one cohesive attention span. Actually, that I got distracted there for a second because I was realizing there was actually a very good study that's very analogous to this. It didn't have to do with driving. It had to do with just noticing things in the environment. And so this study was conducted at Western Washington University, and there was a guy dressed like a clown riding around on a unicycle in the middle of campus. And the researchers watched, and as pedestrians went by, they would ask, did you see the clown on the unicycle? And people who were walking by themselves and just walking, 100% saw the clown on the unicycle. 100% people just walking by themselves. People who were walking with a friend, one of the pair typically saw the unicycle. Maybe not be that both of them saw it, but one of them saw it. Maybe they're enmeshed in talking, and the person who saw it didn't want to interrupt the speaker and didn't say anything about the unicycle, but at least one person saw it in each dyad, each pair. The people who were looking at their phones as they passed, it was like 20% who noticed that there was a clown on a unicycle. So being alone or with another person, very likely to notice what's going on in the environment, especially something surprising and unusual that has motion involved in it, right? A person riding a unicycle dressed like a clown, bright colors. But being distracted by your cell phone, you're not going to see the surprising things, right? The things you don't expect to see. And that's what happens when you're driving, is that you kind of expect the road ahead of you to continue to be straight. You expect the road ahead of you to be clear of pedestrians or stopped cars. You expect it to be what it's always been every other time you've ever driven this stretch of the road. And that's where it can get really risky, because sometimes cars are stopped in the road. Sometimes a pedestrian is crossing the road. One time I was coming home at night, and there was a person sitting in the slow lane of traffic on a 4 lane highway with a universal turn lane in the middle. Just sitting, like literally just sitting in the slow lane. And all of the cars are like, whoa, what? And having to move, and all sorts of very like erratic stuff going on as one by one people are recognizing there's a person sitting in this lane. And for no reason at all. There was nothing going on that could have accounted for why this person was sitting in the lane. So, surprising things do happen, but when we're distracted, we don't see the surprising things. We see what we expect to see. And that's the cautionary tale I'd like to leave you with the issue of driving distractedly. All right, hopefully that I've warned you really well and you don't want to drive distractedly anymore. All right, I will see you in the next chapter.